Welcome, everybody. This is the end of our 8-week series of the HR Disruptor Summit, Fall 2021 live stream speaker series. And I am Jan Barlow, your moderator for this session. And my special guest, I like to say that, normally people say the keynote is the first of your event. Our keynote is the last because we are really excited to talk about a very special topic that really, if you go on LinkedIn or anywhere right now, it is the hottest topic. And that's pretty much how we are finally waking up as human beings to realize that the hiring process is broken and it is affecting, as we see with the Great Resignation. Welcome, Dr. Marilyn Schlitz. Thank you so much for being with us today. I appreciate you.
I'm excited to be here.
Well, if you would, share a little bit about your background and what your journey has been since you were with the Noetic Science group.
Sure. Well, I'm a social scientist and an anthropologist, so that's my training. And I have been doing research since, I guess, the first project was in 1979. And I've covered a lot of ground in that time. And I was involved with the Institute of Noetic Sciences for about 25 years, which was fabulous. And so we were really interested in exploring consciousness and sort of the furthest reaches of our human potentials. And when I left IONS, it was time. It was a graduation for me. And I ended up making a film, a documentary called Death Makes Life Possible with Dr. Deepak Chopra, and also wrote a book on that topic. And then after that, I gravitated toward teaching. And I'm now a professor in the Department of Transpersonal Psychology at Sofia University, where we train people everywhere from bachelor completion to PhDs. And we are also really interested in taking some of the content out through what I call Stallion Springs Academy, which is a way in which I put out sort of lifelong learning programs. So that's my journey.
I love it. When you spoke about your work and your book, working with Deepak Chopra, what was that like as far as from that perspective of seeing our evolution as human beings?
Well, it was pretty mind-blowing, really. I had the privilege of doing interviews with masters from the world's religious and spiritual traditions. I interviewed scientists from a variety of different disciplines about, consciousness, death and dying, the grief process, as well as the various worldviews about what happens when we die. And that was really informative, and it continues to deepen. Just today, I did a lecture with a group that supports Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work on the dying process. And so it was a bunch of hospice practitioners. And it's just a real privilege to sort of feel the deepening in myself and the bounty of the work.
I love that. And what I loved about your work, besides working with IONS and my own personal journey and interest in the ever-expanding human awareness and consciousness, but to also, when we talk about that near-death experience, right, that it's very common. It's a topic that people talk about, especially if you've had a heart attack or, again, any near-death physical experience. In relationship, really, to COVID, what we experienced last year and continue to experience, and how that has affected, or it really has affected the Great Resignation, right? And our values of how we look at life. Can you share a little bit about psychologically how that affects us as human beings, that near-death experience?
I would say a few things. First of all, I think that people have a core existential fear of death. and that fear leads to a lot of dysfunctional behaviors and patterns, and particularly when it gets aroused. So when we have some reminders of our mortality and we're not really in a healthy physical, psychological, spiritual sense, it can be very destabilizing. And so having COVID, and all of these deaths, and the global pandemic, it generates a lot of fear. And I think in that process, also some really dysfunctional behaviors. At the same time, I think that as we get a greater sense of awareness of what's important to us and the fact that we don't live forever, I think a lot of people are using the pandemic as an opportunity to really reflect on what's important to them and how they want to live the rest of their lives. So I think it's both a very scary time. I understand that, but it's also a propitious time in the sense that we can really begin to think about, new possibilities.
So, last year when everybody was forced to sit on the couch or sit at home and really reflect, right? I mean, we didn't have the distractions like we used to. We couldn't take the kids to 5 million things and load up our calendars with a lot of external activities, going to stores, shopping. I mean, you can still shop online, but a lot of those distractions were limited. So what, if you could walk us through psychologically, what have really people been dealing with or working with as they sat at home for the last year and a half or whatever? What's been going on from a psychological perspective?
Well, Jan, I don't think it's one thing. I think it's a multitude of things, and people react in different ways at different times. There can be this, profound sense of loneliness. I think that's real. Maybe a sense of disconnection for a lot of people. And at the same time, I think we live at a time when there are these weapons of mass distraction and we're constantly being thrown off course. And so having that moment, or many moments, gave people a chance to really begin to turn their perspective inward, and again to look at what is meaningful in my life. And what we find in terms of change is that it often requires a major disruption to push us into reflection, meaning generating kind of processes. We can either shut it down, we can ignore the fertility of the disruption, or we can begin to question what's important for us. And in that process, start, a period of exploration. And I think the exploration is very useful and important. People have to be careful not to get caught in the endless exploration without beginning to ground what is the next step for me? What do I value? Where do I want to put my energies? And then I think that leads to some practices, and certainly reflection practices, meditative practices, any kind of practice, exercise. I know people were buying exercise equipment for home during, I did.
Sure, yeah. I love it.
Yeah, I love it. That part was great. And then, this process of cultivating some practice. How do we turn the disruption into an opportunity for our own creativity, for our own sense of meaning? Abe Maslow was the founder of transpersonal psychology, and he has this hierarchy of needs. And at the core level are those basic needs. We need food, we need water, we need safety, we need, connection. That was a big disruption that happened for a lot of people. And then there's this higher order, search for my human potentials piece. And he talked about self-actualization as an important piece where I really begin to express, my path forward with a sense of purpose and intention. He also talks about self-transcendence, and that's often forgotten when we think about the pyramid. And in that, it's this move from, the struggle about my own ego identification to recognition that I'm part of a shared humanity. And that sense of connectedness doesn't all have to be localized. It becomes this more overarching sense of our belonging in some really deep fundamental way. And so I think the transformational process is really, either we ignore it completely, we start to understand it in stages, or we embrace it and we begin to think. And I think that's a lot of what this great disruption is people really having this opportunity to reflect on what do I want to be when I grow up,
What a lot of people, what I've been seeing on LinkedIn and through our interactions with our audience, we're seeing a lot of people look at now the journey is an evolution, right? Not from a really an old school mindset of get one job, stay there, and, retire. They're looking at, and this has been really since I know having conversations with clients and with companies since the last Great Recession in 2008, because that whole disruption, retirement used to be that it was financial and, after you were done working for a company for 20 years, you know, that's it, right? There was nothing, you go play golf or whatever. Now it's really that people are recognizing or choosing to live life, so to go out and golf, to go instead of work, and then wait to go have fun or travel or whatever. People have been choosing to create a lifestyle that embraces both. I mean, anybody can make money now. You could go YouTube, TikTok. I mean, we have 12-year-olds making money on TikTok. So it's not the same business or work model as what we've had ages ago. So with that unique, well, it's not unique, but now since we're living in the quantum science world and not carrying over these past programming beliefs, and so we're really creating a new work or way of working. How do you see this playing out? I mean, do you see that more and more people are becoming empowered?
Again, I, don't reify any of these things. I think that some people are and some people aren't. And we see a lot of crisis and disruption in our world. We see a lot of polarization, and then we see that there is sort of a critical mass of people that I think are calling for, and those groups have different agendas, as it were. There are the people who are like the climate activists, and they're really working on that issue. And then there are people who are on this other path. I think one of the factors is a demographic shift, and we see that people are working longer, they are aging healthier, and maybe in that process there's this opportunity to live a more integrated life. And so I think it's a choice people make, and we have all these decision points on the path. And are we defeated by them? Are we polarized by them? Do we let our amygdala, the warning center of our brain, just light up all the time? Or do we begin to reflect on the fact that I don't want my amygdala lighting up all the time?
Right.
And I
It's a
know I
choice.
can condition my amygdala, and I can, make choices. So instead of, inviting the negativity, I can really begin to foster a practice around my own self-actualization and ultimately self-transcendence.
Are you seeing, because I love your work that you do with the transpersonal um, topic, right? Again, free will. As human beings, we're given free will. We get to choose. We get to choose how we feel, how we perceive things. So with that expanding awareness, and I love how you shared that, again, people get to choose, and everybody's a Deepak Chopra quote, everybody's doing their best at their level of consciousness. True?
And we can move our consciousness, we can grow and we can develop. So it's really, it's complicated. I don't think there's just any like flip the light switch. I think it, requires work, it requires practice. We discovered in the work we did a large research project on worldview transformation. We published it in a book called Living Deeply, The Art and Science of Transformation. And we found there were 5 elements to a transformative practice. And that could be really anything. It can be, a meditation practice. It can be a gardening practice. It can be whatever, excites the person and gives them a sense of this is the path I want to take. And it involves, first of all, intention. So I make an intention to recast my life in a positive way and to begin to pay more attention. Because mostly we don't have free will, I would say. Most of what happens in our lives is below the threshold of our conscious awareness. And we're informed by a myriad of biases and assumptions and stereotypes and things we just take for granted very quickly because the intuitive brain works quickly, and it's easier. So it takes a little effort. We have to set intention. And then it's where we place our attention. So is the glass half empty or is it half full? And that's a choice we make. And a lot of the transformative practices, involve this kind of shift in where we put our awareness. So meditative practices, for example, but it doesn't just have to be that. It can be a lot of different things. And then the third piece of the transformative practice is repetition. So when we talk about the amygdala getting hijacked, it requires conditioning our brains and those little neural pathways in our brains. Fortunately, we know we have neuroplasticity and we can change how we react. And when we become aware of our own reactivity, when we bring it into our prefrontal cortex, then we have this opportunity to, reflect on why did I just get triggered there? And I did get triggered there. So what was that about? This opportunity to just check ourselves. So, the repetition is building those new patterns, those new habits. The fourth piece is guidance. And, participating in a program like this today, where we're learning from new people with new ideas, read a book, whatever that is. But it's also important to recognize that guidance is internal. So how do I begin to really calibrate my internal guidance system so that I'm making the kinds of choices I want to make and I can live that life I aspire to? And finally, there is this element of surrender. And that is, instead of all this effortful seeking, there is a comfort in what is so. And, that can be a place of wisdom. It can be in the aging process. It can be in this death awareness realm. It can be in this higher consciousness. So beyond self-actualization to self-transcendence involves a kind of surrender to, my beingness with the whole. And, that is a metaphysical position and it is one I adhere to. But so those are the 5 elements of what a practice looks like. And that's across traditions. It involved interviews with 60 masters. It involved surveys with 2,000 people. It involved several longitudinal studies. So I come to this, with some confidence.
Well, and again, your bubble, what you worked on and being able to present that. And I just still makes me laugh when they call it parapsychology or metaphysical and people think it's woo-woo. Well, it's interesting because if people really understood, just like quantum science, people still, look and go, quantum science, like that's something in the future. That's been talked about since the 70s. So I mean, it just really surprises me that mainstream doesn't talk about those things, or some essence of mainstream science poo-poos that arena, and it's just so behind. That's why I love what the topics and subject matter that we are bringing to light through the summit, and especially speaking and collaborating with people like you and experts like you that are really at the forefront of this science, right? And bringing this information to mainstream. I did have a question. I had one of our team members that we were in a group meeting yesterday, and they asked, does self-awareness and age correlate? Are those, so they were asking, does our self-awareness only come with age?
Yes and no. There is definitely a correlation. Our brains change, and there is the development of this, what they call the wisdom brain, where, there is an opportunity for greater self-awareness. It doesn't mean that all old people become wise, because they don't all become wise. But it, again, with this intention toward self-awareness, it's supported by our physiology. But it's also true that you find very young people who have great wisdom and great awareness. And I think that's happening more and more because this generation are, seeped in a culture that's more accepting of some of these ideas. So it's a both and. The one thing I want to say is, I can get very abstract and I can get lost in my metaphysics and all of the complexities of things like the quantum world. And I love that. But on the other hand, I think there are some really simple, tiny little steps we can take that really are life changing. And, just the simple fact of setting our intention can change everything. We can shift our whole way of interacting with the world. I think, just listening, deep listening to others when we feel reactive or there's a conflict, like where's that person really coming from? Loving kindness is important not only for others, but for ourselves. So if we can just practice a little self-compassion, we can begin to feel more confidence. We can begin to, be more authentic. And so I am a big believer in the little steps as well as the grand cosmological vision.
So when you look at last year, I mean, from my observation and interaction with our audience and other groups, made people more open, or I don't know if it's because of the emotional and psychological disruptor that has happened. It has opened people up more emotionally, to be emotionally available than what they were prior. What would you say?
I'd say you're hanging out with a good crowd. And I don't think it's true for everyone, but the major catalyst for a affirming life positive transformation is pain. It's disruption. It's something that totally shakes our steady state. And from that, we can become more aware and we can settle into that place that is, I think reflected partially in this great disruption. I think part of the great disruption is just that a lot of it hasn't been functional, and people are really starting to see that, like, this just doesn't work for me.
It just
Uh,
doesn't work.
you know, and maybe there's something that could work better, and that's where the exploration and the practice come in. Is we begin to set the stage for that, and then it's really living the practice, because life is the practice. And ultimately, I think there's a whole systems change that's being called for. And, we can see it in the supply chain business. We can see it in the supply chain at multiple levels of our psyche. Things just are taking longer, and, people are using that in some senses. So I just feel for myself, And fortunately, I hang with some of those people who are really about creating positive changes in the world, one step at a time, myself starting with, and then working in community. And then, really recognizing that we need changes in our educational system. Healthcare is completely broken. Business is now having to reorient and pivot on a lot of the assumptions that it was making, they are making, we are making. And, I think that at the level of politics, it's really complicated. And that's true at a global level. So how can each of us just take our tiny little piece and, polish it up as best we can and roll it into the world with a sense of that intention and, really come together potentially as a critical mass that can make this a much more sustainable and just world.
Well, and change starts with us, right?
Yeah.
Changing ourselves. I think mainstream and the general public, we seem to get caught up in the drama, human drama of trying to change others. And I mean, it first starts with us to look at yourself and how can you be better? How can you start living up to your greatness? And like you said, one step at a time. But that starts with us.
And I think people need
right?
to turn off the distractions because the more we watch TV and the news and we are bombarded by it, the more we get caught up in those emotional,
Yeah.
fear-based kinds of thinkings. And I don't think people should not attend to the news. I think the news is important, but some people haven't figured out how to turn it off. And then they're just getting ratcheted up. So how can we find enough time to be quiet and to harness that internal guidance system and be able to make better choices?
That is so true. Dr. Schlitz, thank you so much. I want to ask what programs you have coming up. Do you have any workshops? What's your website that people can engage with and check you out further?
Right.
If you would.
Thank you. I have a thing called Stallion Springs Academy, which is lifelong learning programs. And so that's available for people who are interested in exploring some of these topics that we talked about today. And I have a website. I have two, MarilynSchlitz.com. And I have Death Makes Life Possible, which has a lot of really great stuff related to death, dying, and beyond. And I teach at Sofia University. So if people are interested in pursuing, the academic path, and I'm also just finishing an MBA. So I'm interested in this topic and how it applies to, both the vast philosophical, psychological parts of this thing, and then the practical pieces of how we, conduct business and engage in our collective commerce.
I got to tell you, you couldn't have picked a better. When did you pick this topic? That's my secret question to you. Before COVID or when it was happening?
You're talking about which piece?
Yeah, that you picked your topic of how this affects business, etc. Is this the topic for your other MBA?
Well, it's certainly come more into the fore. I've had an interest in, full systems change, and I've written a little bit about leadership, and a lot of my writing is on my website. So it's under writing on the tab. So you pull down on that, and there's lots and lots and lots of stuff there. And there's blogs and, vlogs and whatever. So no, I've been at it for a long time. And I think this is an opportunity to translate it into a profoundly important social issue. So I've written a little bit about, how to survive the pandemic and, things like that were written from the transformation model. And again, all that stuff would be on my website.
Awesome. Again, Dr. Schlitz, thank you so much for sharing part of your afternoon and your day with us today as we close out the HR Disruptor Summit Fall 2021 Speaker Series. And we will be posting the replay on our Disruptor site and also in our virtual conversations page. So again, look forward to connecting others with you, and thank you again for our time together.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate your work. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.